Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming in person and in Zoom. I'm really excited to be here. So my name is Allison, and I am a master's student at St. Mary's University. So my research is on Iva fructescens, which is a salt marsh shrub. So for those of you who don't know what salt marshes are, they are coastal wetlands that are influenced by the tide, and they provide many ecosystem services such as erosion control, storm and wave surge buffering, carbon sequestration, and habitats for many wildlife species. Because of this, these ecosystems are very important for protecting our coastal communities and for mitigating the effects of climate change. Here in Nova Scotia, our salt marshes are semi-diurnal, so the tides come in. We have two high tides and two low tides a day. This is the same across the east coast of North America, but it does change where you are in the world. Some places in the world, the tide only comes up and down once a day, and this actually will affect the characteristics of the marsh. Along with daily tidal cycles, we also have monthly tidal cycles. So during the new moon and full moon, we actually have what's called spring tides, which is where the highest tide and the high tide is higher and the low tide is lower compared to the neap tides, which are in between full and new moons, and the highs and lows are kind of in the middle. And then with daily tidal cycles, monthly tidal cycles, based on where you are in the world, and for us, where you are in the province, there is differences in tidal ranges. So for the Bay of Fundy, we have the highest tides in the world, and that is based on the structure of the bay. So let's see if I have so the water comes into the bay, but it has nowhere to go except for up. If, say, the Chignecto Isthmus washed out and the water could go all the way through, we wouldn't have those tides anymore. So it's just based on the fact that the water has nowhere else to go. The tidal range is about 15 meters or 48 feet between low and high, versus on the south shore of Nova Scotia, it's about 2.5 meters or 8 feet. So the main reason I'm talking about tidal differences is because the tide actually dictates plant zonation within the marsh. So because the marshes flood so frequently, these plant species have to have adaptations in order to be able to live. So lower in the marsh, the plants have to be more adapted to be flooded more frequently and have longer durations of flooding, versus higher in the marsh, they don't need these adaptations as much. So for example, a low marsh grass, Sporobolus alterniflorus, or formerly Spartina alterniflora, has two adaptations to deal with it being flooded daily, and that is salt excretion in its leaves, and also it has air-filled stems to deal with the lack of oxygen that the roots are getting. So although salt marshes are very important to us for climate change and they're also very cool ecosystems, there has been a lot of salt marsh degradation over the years, especially in the Maritimes. And in the Bay of Fundy itself, it's actually estimated that about 69% of its historic range has been lost. So these salt marshes are lost to things like hard armoring, so seawalls or agricultural dikes, which limit the tidal flow into the ecosystem and just destroy the ecosystem. Anthropogenic disturbances, so pollution or development pressures, maybe people are infilling the marshes and building on them. And then, of course, climate change. So as sea levels rise and there's increased storm activities, the marshes can become drowned and also just damaged from the amount of storms that are hitting them. So how are we trying to fix this? We are trying to fix this with living shorelines. So as you can see, this is kind of what the hard armoring structures look like. The water's not able to come into the ecosystem. And basically, these hard armoring structures actually cause more consequences than good things to happen. So they actually increase erosion and they are expensive to upkeep. So introducing living shorelines, they use they use natural materials and vegetation to restore natural coastal processes and to work with nature instead of against it. Some sites will use hybrid structures, which you'll see here. Where's my mouse? which you'll see here. So this has vegetation, but also has sills, which is just rock structures that kind of break the tide. And that's just because some ecosystems, the wave energy is so strong that the plants themselves can't survive. So it uses a hybrid structure just to do that. And living shorelines are relatively new in Canada, especially Atlantic Canada, which leads into my research. So my research is on Iva fructescens or Marsh Elder. I'm going to refer to it as Iva for the rest of the presentation just for ease. But here's a photo of it here, and it is in the Asteraceae family. It's deciduous. It's about 0.5 meter to 4 meters tall, and it's wind pollinated, which you can see this picture of a flower here. Within Nova Scotia, I find that the shrub is about shoulder height on me. I don't know how much that is in meters, but it's probably about 4 feet tall. But yeah. For its global distribution, Iva occurs on the eastern coast of North America from Nova Scotia down to Texas. Nova Scotia is actually the only province in Canada that has Iva. And within Nova Scotia, it has a very interesting distribution where we only find it in the Minas Bay and Yarmouth areas. So it's not found in the Outer Bay of Fundy, it's not found in Cobequid Bay, and it's not found anywhere else on the south shore of Nova Scotia. So it's very interesting, and we're not really exactly sure why that happens, but hopefully my research can help figure out why. Within its range, the northern part of it is actually, the plant is more rare than the southern part of it. So in Nova Scotia, the species is vulnerable, but in Maine, it's critically imperiled. And I did read a paper that said it was only actually found in 3 towns in the entire state. So very rare in Maine. Versus I read a different paper about Louisiana where they're actually trying to get rid of the shrub because there's too much of it. So based on where you are in its range, the rarity definitely changes. And also there are lots of states that have no rank, so there is minimal research done on it. Within the marsh itself, the shrub tends to occur in distinct bands, which you can see from in this drone image here. These thick, this dark green area is the Iva bands, or the other photo of the flooding, which you can really see the Iva bands because it sticks up above the tide. In Nova Scotia, it is actually the only shrub that occurs in salt marshes. And when you compare this to other studies in the New England or Rhode Island area, they are finding a similar distribution within the marsh. So they are finding these distinct bands, and they deduced that this was because the shrub has a lower salt tolerance than other salt marsh species, which pushes it back into the marsh. But then it has a greater salt tolerance than other shrubs, and it gets outcompeted by other shrubs, so it's pushed forward, and it just is stuck in this distinct band here. But because this shrub is more salt tolerant than other shrubs, it could be very useful in incorporating it into our living shorelines because it can actually withstand the salt and the flooding better than any other shrub. So why would we even want Iva in the shorelines? So there's a couple of reasons. First of all, the roots are fibrous, so they are sediment binding, so they keep the sediment onto the shore and they decrease erosion. There have also been studies proven that shrub and grass mixtures are better at decreasing overland flow rates, which will again decrease erosion, and also reducing agricultural runoff than say just a shrub or just grass. The agricultural runoff could be very important because the Iva tends to occur near dikes and agricultural land, so it could definitely really easily be used to kind of prevent the pollution of those nutrients into the water. Another study suggested that it could be useful for preventing invasive species such as Phragmites australis. And this is because the shrub grows really densely and would just kind of limit the recruitment of that species into the marsh, which I think is really cool. And then, of course, as you saw in the last picture, the top of the shrub sticks up above the water. So it is refuge for many marsh species because as the tide comes in, they have somewhere to go. So even though IVA could be very, very important in our living shorelines, there has actually been very minimal research done on it. The only studies that I have found have been in the New England area or the one that I found in Louisiana. And in Nova Scotia, the only study that I found was there was a student at Acadia looking at seed viability, but nothing to do with the shrub out in the environment. So my main research objective is just to find out what are the environmental preferences of IVA? Where does it live? At what elevations? How frequently is it flooded? What kind of sediment does it like? And who does it live with? So what are its vegetation communities? I also wanted to look into local adaptation because in Nova Scotia, it occurs in the Minas Basin and Yarmouth areas, which are so different from each other and far away. I wanted to see if those two populations were different from each other, because one population may be better in living shorelines than the other. And then I also, of course, wanted to look into planting techniques to aid in adding this plant to living shorelines. So what is my progress update so far? So over the summer, I was able to do some of my survey. So I went to 4 sites in the Minas Basin here, which you can see some of them are on the Cogmagan River, some on the Cornwallis River, and then Grand Prairie isn't on a river. It's kind of just, if anyone knows where the gully is, it's the same location. And at each site, I did transects through the IVA sections. So you can see the, where is my mouse? Oh, it's on my page here. You can see my transects here, where the orange plots are plots with no IVA and the green plots are plots with IVA. And I just wanted to capture the micro differences between areas with and without IVA. So areas with IVA, plots with IVA and plots without were only about half a meter apart, just to kind of get those micro differences. And you can see what kind of the transect looks like on the right there, where you can see no IVA going down into the IVA zone. In the transects at each of the plots, I did vegetation cover. So I used the point intercept method, which is just a common method for determining percent cover of species within a plot. You basically just stick a stick in each corner of the grid, and whatever touches it, you mark down. And you're able to multiply it and figure out percent cover. And then I also tested or collected elevation data for each of the plots and took sediment samples. So for sediment, I'm testing bulk density, organic matter, nutrients, and total nitrogen. So I do have a couple of preliminary results. I wasn't able to send off my soil samples yet, and I didn't look at any of the vegetation data, but I was able to look at the elevation. So where are we finding IVA so far in Nova Scotia? So we can see that in all of the sites, the IVA is clustered kind of around the same elevation, around that -13 area. And they are also clustered above the highest high water mean tide and below the highest high water large tide, which in simple terms basically just means it is not flooded with every high tide, it's only flooded with the spring tides. So the tides during full moons and new moons, which happens about 4 to 6 days per month. When I compare this to other studies, it is similar to Rhode Island and other New England areas where they found that the IVA was flooded with every spring tide and not every tide. But I also found a study in Maryland, which is lower in its frame, where they found that the IVA actually flooded with every high tide, spring or neap. So those are very interesting differences in results. I was also able to do 2 planting experiments. So the first one was in Mahone Bay, which you can see here. So Mahone Bay is on the south shore of Nova Scotia. And this was a pilot project living shoreline that they put in 2022. So they do plan to extend the shoreline down further. This was just a pilot project just to see how it goes and to get everybody on board to doing the entire shore. The sediment here is very gravelly, as you can see, and we are not in the Bay of Fundy, so we don't see those crazy tidal ranges versus the other site that I went to, which was on the Cornwallis River in the valley. So this was a recently realigned dike. So the photo that you see with me crouching, that is where the dike was. And they pushed it backwards because it was starting to erode into the bank and they just wanted to realign it. So a fresh new site to plant. But this one is in the Bay of Fundy and you can see that it is very muddy, which I do really think affected my results. This is kind of what the planting experiments and planting days look like. So all of my IVA plants were sourced from Bay of Fundy areas. So for Mahone Bay, it was sourced from Kingsport. And then for the Valley site, it was actually, there was IVA on site. So I just kind of moved it over. And I did 4 treatments per site. So one of them was seedlings only, which the seedlings you can see on the left. And then one of them was offshoots only, which you can see them laying on the ground on the right. One of them was mixed, and then one of them was bare, just for control. And after planting, I measured the heights and number of leaves for the seedlings and the offshoots. And I also went back weekly to look at survival and water them if needed. So like I said, one site, I think that the muddiness affected my results. One site did significantly better than the other. So Mahone Bay only had about 10% and 30% deaths versus the Valley had 94% of the seedlings die and 75% of the offshoots die. So that was very unfortunate. And if you look at also our number of leaves, you can see that in Mahone Bay, the average number of leaves per plant significantly increased from the start to the end of the season, where it went from about 6 leaves per plant to 19, versus the Valley, where it actually went from 8 to 7. So they were not happy there. And then for the number of leaves in per offshoot, Mahone Bay, we saw a similar pattern where it went to about an average of 53 to 77, versus in the Valley, it went from 38 to 22. So visually, what did that look like? You can see here at the top row is the day of planting, what a seedling plot looked like. The Valley site did have wilted seedlings to begin with. It was a pretty hot day when we planted it out versus Mahone Bay. It was kind of cloudy. And then at the end of the season, you can see that Mahone Bay is very lush, lots of alive plants, lots of leaves. They're much bigger versus the Valley site where there is 1, maybe 2 seedlings alive. Um, so why do I think that this happened exactly? When I compare my planting elevations to the survey elevations, you can see that the Valley site, which is the orange one on top, we planted in the right spot. So it is kind of clustered the same spot that the survey was. But then Mahone Bay, we actually planted it too high into the tidal frame. So it's actually not even flooded at all. It's above the highest astronomical tide. So it would only really be flooded with storm surges and things like that, which we luckily actually didn't have this year. So that, and then also I may have accidentally planted the Valley site right before a bunch of spring tides. So within the first week, the plants were completely drowned, and because of the amount of sediment in the Bay of Fundy, a lot of the seedlings got buried, and a lot of the site got waterlogged, and that's probably the reason that they didn't do very well. So far, what are my lessons learned? So first of all, we figured out where to plant. So above the mean high tide level and then below the spring high tide level, if that makes sense. Um, Also timing matters. So maybe next time I don't plant before a bunch of spring tides. I need to look into that better. And then of course, location matters. So Mahone Bay versus the Valley site, in and out of the Bay of Fundy are of course very different. And I do think that even if we had planted Mahone Bay in the right spot, where it was flooded, we wouldn't have seen as much death as we saw in the Valley because we're not seeing those crazy tidal ranges. We're not getting those crazy tides that you get in the Bay of Fundy. And also, Mahone Bay is kind of sediment starved. So there's not a lot of sediment in the water and they wouldn't have gotten buried. So what are my next steps? So what am I going to do next year? So I am, of course, going to continue to monitor my planting experiments. I don't have high hopes that the valley site will come back, but I am, of course, still going to go check. And then I also want to add transects to my survey. So I do want to get some IVA data from down in Yarmouth to kind of compare between the two sites and get like an overall view of where it lives in Nova Scotia. I also need to do a common garden experiment. So like I mentioned earlier, I wanted to test local adaptation. And the way that I'm going to do this is I had seeds from the Minas Basin area, seeds from Yarmouth, and then I'm looking into getting some seeds from the States. And I'm going to grow them all under the same conditions to see if there's differences between populations. Maybe the Bay of Fundy plants are more fit for just living anywhere because they experience these harsh conditions all the time, or maybe Yarmouth is better, or maybe Yarmouth is better for South Shore, but then Bay of Fundy is better for Bay of Fundy areas. So just to test kind of those kind of differences. And then because I'm going to have so many plants from my common garden, we are going to plant some more out. It's probably not going to be for my project, just because I only have about a year and a half left. But we were talking about replanting at the valley site, just higher onto the dike, and also potentially in the isthmus. But yeah, again, that probably won't be for my project, but we do want to put those plants somewhere. And thank you. Is there any questions?
Have there been similar studies anywhere in the States or not much research?
There's been studies on like elevation and kind of those kind of like what plants it usually lives with Juncus gerardii, if you know what blackgrass. And it usually based on where you are, lives above the mean high water level. But there haven't really been any studies that I read about like soil nutrient differences. For soils, I did read that they liked more areas that can drain better. So maybe with more sand, or if they manipulated the water table, the plant was able to live better. But so soil nutrients, and then also I haven't seen any planting experiments other than density related planting experiments. So differences in like plant age, I haven't seen any studies on. And then I haven't seen any local adaptation or any sort of genetic research on it at all.
I lived near the Wolfville area and there for a lot of time. I never thought about it not being as uncommon as it is, even around all around the Minas Basin. Yeah.
Yeah, it is very interesting that it only occurs in really small part of Nova Scotia. And it doesn't make any sense that it's not in the Cobequid Bay because it's kind of like right next to it. So why would it not? It is, I don't, yeah. Yeah.
Other than the actual growth of the plant, what is the advantage of IVA?
Like in the shorelines? Yeah, so the roots hold the sediment.
Mind repeating the question so the people on Zoom can hear what the question is?
Yes, I can. So she asked, other than it growing, what are the actual benefits of IVA? And so the roots are sediment binding, so they keep sediment onto the shore, so reduce erosion. And then also because of its woody structures, any overland water flow gets slowed down by shrubs and grasses. So that will also prevent erosion. And then it also has been shown to proven or to reduce agricultural runoff. So like nutrients from fertilizers and stuff, they don't come into the main water channel as much because those shrubs kind of trap it. Another one was that it can prevent invasive species from coming in. So because it's grown like in such a dense area and together, it kind of limits the recruitment of invasive species into the marsh. And then it also just provides refuge and habitat for many species because it's so tall, and it doesn't get completely submerged. So Peter says he sees IVA down in Tusket, and it almost always co-occurs with I'm not gonna try to pronounce that. Baccharis, sometimes right in each other's shadow. Do you know of any nurse plant relationships within that Asteraceae tribe? I don't. The only nurse plant interactions that I've read is again with Juncus gerardii or blackgrass, where the Iva provides shade for the juncus, and then the juncus actually releases oxygen into the soil, which, like I mentioned earlier, Iva doesn't really like to be flooded a lot. So that kind of helps it live better. But I haven't read anything about that species, but it would be interesting to see if I get an association with that in the Nova Scotia marshes. Welcome.
The limited amount of range that it has relative to the degree of salinity in the soil.
Yeah.
Is that too narrow, or is it are you finding Mahone Bay, it seems that it's possible to spread out its natural range a bit to give it a little more use of holding soil and things like that?
I think that it depends on the site. So some of the Iva, the question was, due to its salinity, is the range of the Iva too thin, or are we seeing that it's able to kind of expand its range? So I think that definitely depends on the site, because at some sites I'm seeing like really thin Iva bands, like almost like one shrub next to each other. But some of them I'm seeing like the shrubs are really expanded. And we were seeing maybe like 10 across the way. So I think it definitely depends on the site and probably the topography of the site. Because if there's like a larger mound, it probably can colonize the larger area. But as for like lower into the tidal frame, I don't think that it does. I did see an experiment where they planted Iva lower into the marsh and all the plants died. So I don't think that it can necessarily go lower, but it could probably go higher, if that makes sense.
It's a competition that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which is interesting because I'm not seeing a lot of shrubs. I'm not seeing any other competitive shrubs around Iva in the marsh. So as for its upper range, maybe there just isn't one, or maybe it's something else. I'm not sure yet. Yeah.
Do all spring tides reach the same level?
Charlie asked, do all spring tides reach the same level? No. They're definitely higher in like the fall and spring. And also we live in like an 18-year cycle where the tides are increasingly getting bigger. I don't know very much about that cycle, but no, the quick answer, no. Yeah. Yeah, no, it could. It could.
It's very low amount of levels.
Yeah.
Good effective.
Yeah, no, for sure. For the graph, I did use like a average. So I just pulled the tidal data from the Hantsport Tidal Center. I don't know if it's a center, but I just took the data from there to put it onto the graph. I didn't measure that myself.
What's your project?
So the degree is 2 years. So I started in May, and I'll have next summer and then all of the winter, and I'll hopefully graduate in May, but there is a chance that it gets extended a little bit. Yeah.
You're saying you thought some other people could pick up on some of the things.
Yeah, no, for sure. There's some, I think there's a student that she wants to look at the actual sediment binding properties of it. So when I planted in Mahone Bay, I planted like I measured an original elevation of each of the plots, so that in however many years they can kind of see how maybe the bare plots didn't build up as much as the Iva plots did, and then you can kind of see how Iva helps bring sediment into the shore. Yeah. Yeah.
Are increasing water temperatures having any effect on your work?
I don't actually know the answer to that, to be honest. Increasing water temperatures. That is a good question. I feel like probably not. Sea level rise in general, yes. But as for temperatures, I haven't seen anything, and I want to say they probably won't, just based on how infrequent the Iva is flooded. But that would definitely be an interesting thing to look at. Yeah.
It should be earlier, you thought it might be expanding its range. And so maybe that-
Yeah, so my supervisor was talking to somebody who worked for the province, and they found that Iva was actually expanding its range. So hopefully, maybe in a couple of years, it'll just continue to grow, and it's continuing to show up at more sites. So yeah.
Yeah, that question and answer gets me wondering about, yeah, if we're at the northern edge of its
Mhm.
range, and things are getting warmer, then maybe its northern range, it'll do better here in time, and the range could go further north.
No, and that's for sure, especially, and I think about that based on its distribution in Nova Scotia because the Minas Basin area is so warm. And then also Yarmouth is like, especially the areas in Yarmouth that I found it are sheltered. And then, of course, it's warmer because it's lower or it's further south. So maybe, yeah, as the temperatures increase, its range will eventually expand and we'll have more of it in Nova Scotia. Yeah, it's an interesting thing to think
And we
about.
keep finding it.
Yeah, if I keep planning it, there will hopefully be more of it too. Yeah.
Is there any part of your project that you were able to do because of the donation we made to you, or you might not have been able to do otherwise? You know?
I think definitely. So I have two supervisors, but only one of them really provides funding for supplies and stuff like that. The other one kind of just only goes to my stipend. So I actually have used some of it to, so if you saw like the syringes that I used for in the PVC pipes for collecting the sediment, um, my lab is also very big and there are a lot of people that need those, need them to do their sediment. So I just went out and got my own and, also like flags for planting and stuff like that. Yeah. Yeah.
Regard to agricultural runoff, are there any particular toxins that affect it or that it removes?
I haven't read anything on that at all. Oh yeah, sorry. The question was, in regards to agricultural runoff, have I seen any toxins that it removes or that affects IVA? So I haven't seen anything. So like I said, there's minimal research on IVA in particular. The studies that I found on the agricultural runoff and decreased overland rates was not actually using IVA. It was using just a shrub and a grass, and they were kind of measuring it on these slopes. So for IVA in particular, I don't actually know. Um, there hasn't been any research done on that. Yeah, that I found at least. Yeah.
David here
Thank you,
says,
David.
nice work, thinking enthusiasm, glad we're able to provide a little support.
Thank you, David.
Well, if there's no more questions, to wrap up, I'm gonna just walk over to her computer so I can.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so Allison, we want to really thank you for all the work you've done. If you didn't catch this earlier, Allison was recipient of the grant that we gave in the springtime for her work, and we were really quite keen on her project, and particularly with the living shoreline aspect of it, and looks like she's well on her way to getting some interesting results on this project, so it's encouraging. And thanks for a really good presentation too. Learned a lot about Eva today. Okay. There you go. Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Allison. Thank you. Thank you. Many thank yous on the chat here. So there you go.